Chapter 1. It must have been a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon that it happened, the afternoon of June 3rd, 1916. It seems incredible that all that I have passed through, all those weird and terrifying experiences, should have been encompassed within so short a span as 3 brief months. Rather might I have experienced a cosmic cycle, with all its changes and evolutions, for that which I have seen with my own eyes in this brief interval of time, things that no other mortal eye had seen before. Glimpses of a world past, a world dead, a world so long dead that even in the lowest Cambrian stratum no trace of it remains. Fused with the melting inner crust, it has passed forever beyond the ken of man, other than in that lost pocket of the earth whither fate has borne me, and where my doom is sealed. I am here, and here must remain. After reading this far, my interest, which already had been stimulated by the finding of the manuscript, was approaching the boiling point. I had come to Greenland for the summer, on the advice of my physician, and was slowly being bored to extinction, as I had thoughtlessly neglected to bring sufficient reading matter. Being an indifferent fisherman, my enthusiasm for this form of sport soon waned. Yet in the absence of other forms of recreation, I was now risking my life in an entirely inadequate boat off Cape Farewell, at the southernmost extremity of Greenland. Greenland! As a descriptive appellation, it is a sorry joke, but my story has nothing to do with Greenland, nothing to do with me, so I shall get through with the one and the other as rapidly as possible. The inadequate boat finally arrived at a precarious landing, the natives waist deep in the surf assisting. I was carried ashore, and while the evening meal was being prepared, I wandered to and fro along the rocky, shattered shore. Bits of surf-harried beach clove the worn granite, or whatever the rocks of Cape Farewell may be composed of, and as I followed the ebbing tide down one of these soft stretches, I saw the thing. Were one to bump into a Bengal tiger in the ravine behind the Bimini Baths, one could be no more surprised than was I to see a perfectly good quart thermos bottle turning and twisting in the surf of Cape Farewell, at the southern extremity of Greenland. I rescued it, but I was soaked above the knees doing it, and then I sat down in the sand and opened it, and in the long twilight read the manuscript, neatly written and tightly folded, which was its contents. You have read the opening paragraph, and if you are an imaginative idiot like myself, you will want to read the rest of it, so I shall give it to you here, omitting quotation marks, which are difficult of remembrance. In 2 minutes you will forget me. My home is in Santa Monica. I am, or was, junior member of my father's firm. We are shipbuilders. Of recent years we have specialized on submarines, which we have built for Germany, England, France, and the United States. I know a sub as a mother knows her baby's face, and have commanded a score of them on their trial runs. Yet my inclinations were all toward aviation. I graduated under Curtis, and after a long siege with my father, obtained his permission to try for the Lafayette Escadrille. As a stepping stone, I obtained an appointment in the American Ambulance Service, and was on my way to France when 3 shrill whistles altered, in as many seconds, my entire scheme of life. I was sitting on deck with some of the fellows who were going into the American Ambulance Service with me, my Airedale, Crown Prince Nobler, asleep at my feet, when the first blast of the whistle shattered the peace and security of the ship. Ever since entering the U-boat zone, we had been on the lookout for periscopes, and children that we were, bemoaning the unkind fate that was to see us safely into France on the morrow without a glimpse of the dread marauders. We were young, we craved thrills, and God knows we got them that day, yet by comparison with that through which I have since passed, they were as tame as a Punch and Judy show. I shall never forget the ashy faces of the passengers as they stampeded for their life belts, though there was no panic. Nobbs rose with a low growl. I rose also, and over the ship's side I saw, not 200 yards distant, the periscope of a submarine. While racing toward the liner, the wake of a torpedo was distinctly visible. We were aboard an American ship, which, of course, was not armed. We were entirely defenseless, yet without warning we were being torpedoed. I stood rigid, spellbound, watching the white wake of the torpedo. It struck us on the starboard side almost amidships. The vessel rocked as though the sea beneath it had been uptorn by a mighty volcano. We were thrown to the decks, bruised and stunned, and then above the ship, carrying with it fragments of steel and wood and dismembered human bodies, rose a column of water hundreds of feet into the air. The silence which followed the detonation of the exploding torpedo was almost equally horrifying. It lasted for perhaps 2 seconds, to be followed by the screams and moans of the wounded, the cursing of the men, and the hoarse commands of the ship's officers. They were splendid, they and their crew. Never before had I been so proud of my nationality as I was that moment. In all the chaos which followed the torpedoing of the liner, no officer or member of the crew lost his head or showed in the slightest any degree of panic or fear. While we were attempting to lower boats, the submarine emerged and trained guns on us. The officer in command ordered us to lower our flag, but this the captain of the liner refused to do. The ship was listing frightfully to starboard, rendering the port boats useless, while half the starboard boats had been demolished by the explosion. Even while the passengers were crowding the starboard rail and scrambling into the few boats left to us, the submarine commenced shelling the ship. I saw one shell burst in a group of women and children, and then I turned my head and covered my eyes. When I looked again, to horror was added chagrin, for with the emerging of the U-boat I had recognized her as a product of our own shipyard. I knew her to a rivet. I had superintended her construction. I had sat in that very conning tower and directed the efforts of the sweating crew below when first her prow clove the sunny summer waters of the Pacific. And now this creature of my brain and hand had turned Frankenstein, bent upon pursuing me to my death. A second shell exploded upon the deck. One of the lifeboats, frightfully overcrowded, swung at a dangerous angle from its davits. A fragment of the shell shattered the bow tackle, and I saw the women and children and the men vomited into the sea beneath, while the boat dangled stern up for a moment from its single davit, and at last, with increasing momentum, dived into the midst of the struggling victims screaming upon the face of the waters. Now I saw men spring to the rail and leap into the ocean. The deck was tilting to an impossible angle. Nobs braced himself with all 4 feet to keep from slipping into the scuppers, and looked up into my face with a questioning whine. I stooped and stroked his head. "Come on, boy," I cried, and running to the side of the ship, dived head foremost over the rail. When I came up, the first thing I saw was Nobs swimming about in a bewildered sort of way a few yards from me. At sight of me his ears went flat, and his lips parted in a characteristic grin. The submarine was withdrawing toward the north, but all the time it was shelling the open boats, 3 of them, loaded to the gunwales with survivors. Fortunately, the small boats presented a rather poor target, which, combined with the bad marksmanship of the Germans, preserved their occupants from harm, and after a few minutes a blotch of smoke appeared upon the eastern horizon, and the U-boat submerged and disappeared. All the time the lifeboats had been pulling away from the danger of the sinking liner, and now, though I yelled at the top of my lungs, they either did not hear my appeals for help or else did not dare return to succor me. Nobs and I had gained some little distance from the ship when it rolled completely over and sank. We were caught in the suction only enough to be drawn backward a few yards, neither of us being carried beneath the surface. I glanced hurriedly about for something to which to cling. My eyes were directed toward the point at which the liner had disappeared, when there came from the depths of the ocean the muffled reverberation of an explosion, and almost simultaneously a geyser of water in which were shattered lifeboats, human bodies, steam, coal, oil, and the flotsam of a liner's deck leaped high above the surface of the sea, a watery column momentarily marking the grave of another ship in this greatest cemetery of the seas. When the turbulent waters had somewhat subsided and the sea had ceased to spew up wreckage, I ventured to swim back in search of something substantial enough to support my weight and that of Nobs as well. I had gotten well over the area of the wreck when, not a half-dozen yards ahead of me, a lifeboat shot bow foremost out of the ocean almost its entire length, to flop down upon its keel with a mighty splash. It must have been carried far below, held to its mother ship by a single rope, which finally parted to the enormous strain put upon it. In no other way can I account for its having leaped so far out of the water, a beneficent circumstance to which I doubtless owe my life and that of another far dearer to me than my own. I say beneficent circumstance even in the face of the fact that a fate far more hideous confronts us than that which we escaped that day. For because of that circumstance I have met her whom otherwise I never should have known. I have met and loved her. At least I have had that great happiness in life, nor can Caspak, with all her horrors, expunge that which has been. So, for the 1000th time, I thank the strange fate which sent that lifeboat hurtling upward from the green pit of destruction to which it had been dragged, sent it far up above the surface, emptying its water as it rose above the waves, and dropping it upon the surface of the sea, buoyant and safe. It did not take me long to clamber over its side and drag Nobs in to comparative safety, and then I glanced around upon the scene of death and desolation which surrounded us. The sea was littered with wreckage, among which floated the pitiful forms of women and children, buoyed up by their useless life belts. Some were torn and mangled. Others lay rolling quietly to the motion of the sea, their countenances composed and peaceful. Others were set in hideous lines of agony or horror. Close to the boat's side floated the figure of a girl. Her face was turned upward, held above the surface by her life belt, and was framed in a floating mass of dark and waving hair. She was very beautiful. I had never looked upon such perfect features, such a divine molding which was at the same time human, intensely human. It was a face filled with character and strength and femininity, the face of one who was created to love and to be loved. The cheeks were flushed to the hue of life and health and vitality, and yet she lay there upon the bosom of the sea, dead. I felt something rise in my throat as I looked down upon that radiant vision, and I swore that I should live to avenge her murder. And then I let my eyes drop once more to the face upon the water, and what I saw nearly tumbled me backward into the sea, for the eyes in the dead face had opened, the lips had parted, and one hand was raised toward me in a mute appeal for succor. She lived! She was not dead. I leaned over the boat's side and drew her quickly into the comparative safety which God had given me. I removed her life belt and my soggy coat and made a pillow for her head. I chafed her hands and arms and feet. I worked over her for an hour, and at last I was rewarded by a deep sigh, and again those great eyes opened and looked into mine. At that I was all embarrassment. I have never been a ladies' man. At Leland Stanford I was the butt of the class because of my hopeless imbecility in the presence of a pretty girl, but the men liked me nevertheless. I was rubbing one of her hands when she opened her eyes, and I dropped it as though it were a red-hot rivet. Those eyes took me in slowly from head to foot. Then they wandered slowly around the horizon, marked by the rising and falling gunwales of the lifeboat. They looked at Nobs and softened, and then came back to me filled with questioning. I stammered, moving away and stumbling over the next thwart. The vision smiled wanly. "Aye, aye, sir," she replied faintly, and again her lips drooped, and her long lashes swept the firm, fair texture of her skin. "I hope that you are feeling better," I finally managed to say. "Do you know," she said after a moment of silence, "I have been awake for a long time, but I did not dare to open my eyes. I thought I must be dead, and I was afraid to look, for fear that I should see nothing but blackness about me. I am afraid to die. Tell me what happened after the ship went down. I remember all that happened before. Oh, but I wish that I might forget it." A sob broke her voice. "The beasts," she went on after a moment, "and to think that I was to have married one of them, a lieutenant in the German navy." Presently she resumed as though she had not ceased speaking. "I went down and down and down. I thought I should never cease to sink. I felt no particular distress until I suddenly started upward at ever increasing velocity. Then my lungs seemed about to burst, and I must have lost consciousness, for I remember nothing more until I opened my eyes after listening to a torrent of invective against Germany and Germans. Tell me, please, all that happened after the ship sank." I told her then, as well as I could, all that I had seen, the submarine shelling the open boats, and all the rest of it. She thought it marvelous that we should have been spared in so providential a manner, and I had a pretty speech upon my tongue's end, but lacked the nerve to deliver it. Nobs had come over and nosed his muzzle into her lap, and she stroked his ugly face, and at last she leaned over and put her cheek against his forehead. I have always admired Nobs, but this was the first time that it had ever occurred to me that I might wish to be Nobs. I wondered how he would take it, for he is as unused to women as I, but he took to it as a duck takes to water. What I lack of being a ladies' man, Nobs certainly makes up for as a lady's dog. The old scallywag just closed his eyes and put on one of the softest sugar wouldn't melt in my mouth expressions you ever saw, and stood there taking it and asking for more. It made me jealous. "You seem fond of dogs," I said. "I am fond of this dog," she replied. Whether she meant anything personal in that reply I did not know, but I took it as personal, and it made me feel mighty good. As we drifted about upon that vast expanse of loneliness, it is not strange that we should quickly become well acquainted. Constantly we scanned the horizon for signs of smoke, venturing guesses as to our chances of rescue. But darkness settled, and the black night enveloped us without ever the sight of a speck upon the waters. We were thirsty, hungry, uncomfortable, and cold. Our wet garments had dried but little, and I knew that the girl must be in grave danger from the exposure to a night of cold and wet upon the water in an open boat, without sufficient clothing and no food. I had managed to bail all the water out of the boat with cupped hands, ending by mopping the balance up with my handkerchief, a slow and back-breaking procedure. Thus I had made a comparatively dry place for the girl to lie down low in the bottom of the boat, where the sides would protect her from the night wind, and when at last she did so, almost overcome as she was by weakness and fatigue, I threw my wet coat over her further to thwart the chill. But it was of no avail. As I sat watching her, the moonlight marking out the graceful curves of her slender young body, I saw her shiver. "Isn't there something I can do?" I asked. "You can't lie there chilled through all night. Can't you suggest something?" She shook her head. "We must grin and bear it," she replied after a moment. Nobbler came and lay down on the thwart beside me, his back against my leg, and I sat staring in dumb misery at the girl, knowing in my heart of hearts that she might die before morning came. For what with the shock and exposure, she had already gone through enough to kill almost any woman. And as I gazed down at her, so small and delicate and helpless, There was born slowly within my breast a new emotion. It had never been there before. Now it will never cease to be there. It made me almost frantic in my desire to find some way to keep warm and cooling lifeblood in her veins. I was cold myself, though I had almost forgotten it until Nobbler moved and I felt a new sensation of cold along my leg against which he had lain, and suddenly realized that in that one spot I had been warm. Like a great light came the understanding of a means to warm the girl. Immediately I knelt beside her to put my scheme into practice, when suddenly I was overwhelmed with embarrassment. Would she permit it, even if I could muster the courage to suggest it? Then I saw her frame convulse shudderingly, her muscles reacting to her rapidly lowering temperature, and casting prudery to the winds, I threw myself down beside her and took her in my arms, pressing her body close to mine. She drew away suddenly, voicing a little cry of fright, and tried to push me from her. "Forgive me," I managed to stammer. "It is the only way. You will die of exposure if you are not warmed, and Nobs and I are the only means we can command for furnishing warmth." And I held her tightly while I called Nobs and bade him lie down at her back. The girl didn't struggle any more when she learned my purpose, but she gave 2 or 3 little gasps, and then began to cry softly, burying her face on my arm, and thus she fell asleep. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. Toward morning I must have dozed, though it seemed to me at the time that I had lain awake for days instead of hours. When I finally opened my eyes, it was daylight, and the girl's hair was in my face, and she was breathing normally. I thanked God for that. She had turned her head during the night, so that as I opened my eyes, I saw her face not an inch from mine, my lips almost touching hers. It was Nobs who finally awoke her. He got up, stretched, turned around a few times, and lay down again, and the girl opened her eyes and looked into mine. Hers went very wide at first, and then slowly comprehension came to her, and she smiled. "You have been very good to me," she said, as I helped her to rise, though if the truth were known I was more in need of assistance than she, the circulation all along my left side seeming to be paralyzed entirely. "You have been very good to me." And that was the only mention she ever made of it. Yet I know that she was thankful, and that only reserve prevented her from referring to what, to say the least, was an embarrassing situation, however unavoidable. Shortly after daylight we saw smoke apparently coming straight toward us, and after a time we made out the squat lines of a tug, one of those fearless exponents of England's supremacy of the sea that tows sailing ships into French and English ports. I stood up on a thwart and waved my soggy coat above my head. Nobs stood upon another and barked. The girl sat at my feet, straining her eyes toward the deck of the oncoming boat. "They see us," she said at last. "There is a man answering your signal." She was right. A lump came into my throat, for her sake rather than for mine. She was saved, and none too soon. She could not have lived through another night upon the channel. She might not have lived through the coming day. The tug came close beside us, and a man on deck threw us a rope. Willing hands dragged us to the deck, Nobs scrambling nimbly aboard without assistance. The rough men were gentle as mothers with the girl. Plying us both with questions, they hustled her to the captain's cabin, and me to the boiler room. They told the girl to take off her wet clothes and throw them outside the door, that they might be dried, and then to slip into the captain's bunk and get warm. They didn't have to tell me to strip after I once got into the warmth of the boiler room. In a jiffy my clothes hung about where they might dry most quickly, and I myself was absorbing through every pore the welcome heat of the stifling compartment. They brought us hot soup and coffee, and then those who were not on duty sat around and helped me damn the Kaiser and his brood. As soon as our clothes were dry, they bade us don them, as the chances were always more than fair in those waters that we should run into trouble with the enemy, as I was only too well aware. What with the warmth and the feeling of safety for the girl, and the knowledge that a little rest and food would quickly overcome the effects of her experiences of the past dismal hours, I was feeling more content than I had experienced since those 3 whistle blasts had shattered the peace of my world the previous afternoon. But peace upon the Channel has been but a transitory thing since August 1914. It proved itself such that morning, for I had scarce gotten into my dry clothes and taken the girl's apparel to the captain's cabin, when an order was shouted down into the engine room for full speed ahead, and an instant later I heard the dull boom of a gun. In a moment I was up on deck to see an enemy submarine about 200 yards off our port bow. She had signaled us to stop, and our skipper had ignored the order. But now she had her gun trained on us, and the second shot grazed the cabin, warning the belligerent tug captain that it was time to obey. Once again an order went down to the engine room, and the tug reduced speed. The U-boat ceased firing and ordered the tug to come about and approach. Our momentum had carried us a little beyond the enemy craft, but we were turning now on the arc of a circle that would bring us alongside her. As I stood watching the maneuver and wondering what was to become of us, I felt something touch my elbow, and turned to see the girl standing at my side. She looked up into my face with a rueful expression. "They seem bent on our destruction," she said, "and it looks like the same boat that sunk us yesterday." "It is," I replied. "I know her well. I helped design her and took her out on her first run." The girl drew back from me with a little exclamation of surprise and disappointment. "I thought you were an American," she said. "I had no idea you were a "Nor am I," I replied. "Americans have been building submarines for all nations for many years. I wish, though, that we had gone bankrupt, my father and I, before ever we turned out that Frankenstein of a thing." We were approaching the U-boat at half speed now, and I could almost distinguish the features of the men upon her deck. A sailor stepped to my side and slipped something hard and cold into my hand. I did not have to look at it to know that it was a heavy pistol. "Take her and use her," was all he said. Our bow was pointed straight toward the U-boat now as I heard word pass to the engine for full speed ahead. I instantly grasped the brazen effrontery of the plucky English skipper. He was going to ram 500 tons of U-boat in the face of her trained gun. I could scarce repress a cheer. At first the Boches didn't seem to grasp his intention. Evidently they thought they were witnessing an exhibition of poor seamanship, and they yelled their warnings to the tug to reduce speed and throw the helm hard to port. We were within 50 feet of them when they awakened to the intentional menace of our maneuver. Their gun crew was off its guard, but they sprang to their piece now and sent a futile shell above our heads. Nobs leaped about and barked furiously. "Let 'em have it!" commanded the tug captain, and instantly revolvers and rifles poured bullets upon the deck of the submersible. 2 of the gun crew went down. The other trained their piece at the waterline of the oncoming tug. The balance of those on deck replied to our small arms fire, directing their efforts toward the man at our wheel. I hastily pushed the girl down the companionway leading to the engine room, and then I raised my pistol and fired my first shot at a Boche. What happened in the next few seconds happened so quickly that details are rather blurred in my memory. I saw the helmsman lunge forward upon the wheel, pulling the helm around so that the tug sheered off quickly from her course, and I recall realizing that all our efforts were to be in vain, because of all the men aboard, fate had decreed that this one should fall first to an enemy bullet. I saw the depleted gun crew on the submarine fire their piece, and I felt the shock of impact and heard the loud explosion as the shell struck and exploded in our bow. I saw and realized these things even as I was leaping into the pilot house and grasping the wheel, standing astride the dead body of the helmsman. With all my strength I threw the helm to starboard, but it was too late to effect the purpose of our skipper. The best I did was to scrape alongside the sub. I heard someone shriek an order into the engine room. The boat shuddered and trembled to the sudden reversing of the engines, and our speed quickly lessened. Then I saw what that madman of a skipper planned since his first scheme had gone wrong. With a loud yelled command, he leaped to the slippery deck of the submersible, and at his heels came his hardy crew. I sprang from the pilot house and followed, not to be left out in the cold when it came to strafing the Boches. From the engine room companionway came the engineer and stockers, and together we leaped after the balance of the crew and into the hand-to-hand fight that was covering the wet deck with red blood. Beside me came Nobs, silent now and grim. Germans were emerging from the open hatch to take part in the battle on deck. At first the pistols cracked amidst the cursing of the men and the loud commands of the commander and his junior, but presently we were too indiscriminately mixed to make it safe to use our firearms, and the battle resolved itself into a hand-to-hand struggle for possession of the deck. The sole aim of each of us was to hurl one of the opposing force into the sea. I shall never forget the hideous expression upon the face of the great Prussian with whom chance confronted me. He lowered his head and rushed at me, bellowing like a bull. With a quick sidestep and ducking low beneath his outstretched arms, I eluded him, and as he turned to come back at me, I landed a blow upon his chin, which sent him spinning toward the edge of the deck. I saw his wild endeavors to regain his equilibrium. I saw him reel drunkenly for an instant upon the brink of eternity, and then with a loud scream slip into the sea. At the same instant a pair of giant arms encircled me from behind and lifted me entirely off my feet. Kick and squirm as I would, I could neither turn toward my antagonist nor free myself from his maniacal grasp. Relentlessly he was rushing me toward the side of the vessel and death. There was none to stay him, for each of my companions was more than occupied by from 1 to 3 of the enemy. For an instant I was fearful for myself, and then I saw that which filled me with a far greater terror for another. My Boche was bearing me toward the side of the submarine against which the tug was still pounding. That I should be ground to death between the two was lost upon me as I saw the girl standing alone upon the tug's deck, as I saw the stern high in air and the bow rapidly settling for the final dive, as I saw death from which I could not save her clutching at the skirts of the woman I now knew all too well that I loved. I had perhaps the fraction of a second longer to live when I heard an angry growl behind us mingle with a cry of pain and rage from the giant who carried me. Instantly he went backward to the deck, and as he did so he threw his arms outwards to save himself, freeing me. I fell heavily upon him, but was upon my feet in the instant. As I arose, I cast a single glance at my opponent. Never again would he menace me or another, for Nob's great jaws had closed upon his throat. Then I sprang toward the edge of the deck closest to the girl upon the sinking tug. "Jump!" I cried. "Jump!" and I held out my arms to her. Instantly, as though with implicit confidence in my ability to save her, she leaped over the side of the tug onto the sloping, slippery side of the U-boat. I reached far over to seize her hand. At the same instant the tug pointed its stern straight toward the sky and plunged out of sight. My hand missed the girl's by a fraction of an inch, and I saw her slip into the sea. But scarce had she touched the water when I was in after her. The sinking tug drew us far below the surface, but I had seized her the moment I struck the water, and so we went down together, and together we came up, a few yards from the U-boat. The first thing I heard was Nobs barking furiously. Evidently he had missed me and was searching. A single glance at the vessel's deck assured me that the battle was over and that we had been victorious, for I saw our survivors holding a handful of the enemy at pistol points, while one by one the rest of the crew was coming out of the craft's interior and lining up on deck with the other prisoners. As I swam toward the submarine with the girl, Nob's persistent barking attracted the attention of some of the tug's crew, so that as soon as we reached the side there were hands to help us aboard. I asked the girl if she was hurt, but she assured me that she was none the worse for this second wetting, nor did she seem to suffer any from shock. I was to learn for myself that this slender and seemingly delicate creature possessed the heart and courage of a warrior. As we joined our own party, I found the tug's mate checking up our survivors. There were 10 of us left, not including the girl. Our brave skipper was missing, as were 8 others. There had been 19 of us in the attacking party, and we had accounted in one way and another during the battle for 16 Germans, and had taken 9 prisoners, including the commander. His lieutenant had been killed. "Not a bad day's work," said Bradley, the mate, when he had completed his roll. "Only losing the skipper," he added, "was the worst. He was a fine man, a fine man." Olson, who in spite of his name was Irish, and in spite of his not being Scotch had been the tug's engineer, was standing with Bradley and me. "Yes," he agreed, "it's a day's work we are after doin', but what are we goin' to be doin' with it now we got it?" "We'll run her into the nearest English port," said Bradley, "and then we'll all go ashore and get our V.C.'s," he concluded, laughing. "How are you going to run her?" queried Olson. "You can't trust these Dutchmen." Bradley scratched his head. "I guess you're right," he admitted, "and I don't know the first thing about a sub." "I do," I assured him. "I know more about this particular sub than the officer who commanded her." Both men looked at me in astonishment, and then I had to explain all over again as I had explained to the girl. Bradley and Olson were delighted. Immediately I was put in command, and the first thing I did was to go below with Olson and inspect the craft thoroughly for hidden Boches and damaged machinery. There were no Germans below, and everything was intact and in ship-shape working order. I then ordered all hands below except one man who was to act as lookout. Questioning the Germans, I found that all except the commander were willing to resume their posts and aid in bringing the vessel into an English port. I believe that they were relieved at the prospect of being detained at a comfortable English prison camp for the duration of the war, after the perils and privations through which they had passed. The officer, however, assured me that he would never be a party to the capture of his vessel. There was, therefore, nothing to do but put the man in irons. As we were preparing to put this decision into force, the girl descended from the deck. It was the first time that she or the German officer had seen each other's faces since we had boarded the U-boat. I was assisting the girl down the ladder and still retained a hold upon her arm, possibly after such support was no longer necessary, when she turned and looked squarely into the face of the German. Each voiced a sudden exclamation of surprise and dismay. "Lys!" he cried, and took a step toward her. The girl's eyes went wide and slowly filled with a great horror as she shrank back. Then her slender figure stiffened to the erectness of a soldier, and with chin in air and without a word she turned her back upon the officer. "Take him away," I directed the 2 men who guarded him, "and put him in irons." When he had gone, the girl raised her eyes to mine. "He is the German of whom I spoke," she said. "He is Baron von Schoenvorts." I merely inclined my head. She had loved him. I wondered if in her heart of hearts she did not love him yet. Immediately I became insanely jealous. I hated Baron Friedrich von Schoenvorts with such utter intensity that the emotion thrilled me with a species of exultation. But I didn't have much chance to enjoy my hatred then, for almost immediately the lookout poked his face over the hatchway and bawled down that there was smoke on the horizon, dead ahead. Immediately I went on deck to investigate, and Bradley came with me. "If she's friendly," he said, "we'll speak her. If she's not, we'll sink her, eh, Captain?" "Yes, Lieutenant," I replied, and it was his turn to smile. We hoisted the Union Jack and remained on deck, asking Bradley to go below and assign to each member of the crew his duty, placing one Englishman with a pistol beside each German. "Half speed ahead," I commanded. More rapidly now we closed the distance between ourselves and the stranger, until I could plainly see the red ensign of the British merchant marine. My heart swelled with pride at the thought that presently admiring British tars would be congratulating us upon our notable capture. And just about then the merchant steamer must have sighted us, for she veered suddenly toward the north, and a moment later dense volumes of smoke issued from her funnels. Then, steering a zigzag course, she fled from us as though we had been the bubonic plague. I altered the course of the submarine and set off in chase, but the steamer was faster than we and soon left us hopelessly astern. With a rueful smile, I directed that our original course be resumed, and once again we set off toward merry England. That was 3 months ago, and we haven't arrived yet, nor is there any likelihood that we ever shall. The steamer we had just sighted must have wirelessed a warning, for it wasn't half an hour before we saw more smoke on the horizon, and this time the vessel flew the white ensign of the Royal Navy and carried guns. She didn't veer to the north or anywhere else, but bore down on us rapidly. I was just preparing to signal her when a flame flashed from her bow, and an instant later the water in front of us was thrown high by the explosion of a shell. Bradley had come on deck and was standing beside me. "About one more of those and she'll have our range," he said. "She doesn't seem to take much stock in our Union Jack." A second shell passed over us, and then I gave the command to change our direction, at the same time directing Bradley to go below and give the order to submerge. I passed Nobs down to him, and following, saw to the closing and fastening of the hatch. It seemed to me that the diving tanks never had filled so slowly. We heard a loud explosion apparently directly above us. The craft trembled to the shock which threw us all to the deck. I expected momentarily to feel the deluge of inrushing water, but none came. Instead, we continued to submerge until the manometer registered 40 feet, and then I knew that we were safe. Safe? I almost smiled. I had relieved Olson, who had remained in the tower at my direction, having been a member of one of the early British submarine crews, and therefore having some knowledge of the business. Bradley was at my side. He looked at me quizzically. "What the devil are we to do?" he asked. "The merchantman will flee us. The war vessel will destroy us. Neither will believe our colors or give us a chance to explain. We will meet even a worse reception if we go nosing around a British port. Mines, nets, and all of it. We can't do it." "Let's try it again when this fellow has lost the scent," I urged. "There must come a ship that will believe us." And try it again we did, only to be almost rammed by a huge freighter. Later we were fired upon by a destroyer, and 2 merchantmen turned and fled at our approach. For 2 days we cruised up and down the channel, trying to tell someone who would listen that we were friends, but no one would listen. After our encounter with the first warship, I had given instructions that a wireless message be sent out explaining our predicament, but to my chagrin I discovered that both sending and receiving instruments had disappeared. "There is only one place you can go," von Schoenbart sent word to me, "and that is Kiel. You can't land anywhere else in these waters. If you wish, I will take you there, and I can promise that you will be treated well." "There is another place we can go," I sent back my reply, "and we will before we'll go to Germany. That place is hell." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Those were anxious days, during which I had but little opportunity to associate with Lys. I had given her the commander's room, Bradley and I taking that of the deck officer, while Olson and 2 of our best men occupied the room ordinarily allotted to petty officers. I made Nobs bed down in Lys's room, for I knew she would feel less alone. Nothing of much moment occurred for a while after we left British waters behind us. We ran steadily along upon the surface, making good time. The first 2 boats we sighted made off as fast as they could go, and the third, a huge freighter, fired on us, forcing us to submerge. It was after this that our troubles commenced. One of the diesel engines broke down in the morning, and while we were working on it, the forward port diving tank commenced to fill. I was on deck at the time and noted the gradual list. Guessing at once what was happening, I leaped for the hatch and, slamming it closed above my head, dropped to the centrale. By this time the craft was going down by the head with a most unpleasant list to port, and I didn't wait to transmit orders to someone else, but ran as fast as I could for the valve that let the sea into the forward port diving tank. It was wide open. To close it and to have the pump started that would empty it were the work of but a minute, but we had had a close call. I knew that the valve had never opened itself. Someone had opened it, someone who was willing to die himself if he might at the same time encompass the death of all of us. After that I kept a guard pacing the length of the narrow craft. We worked upon the engine all that day and night and half the following day. Most of the time we drifted idly upon the surface, but toward noon we sighted smoke due west, and having found that only enemies inhabited the world for us, I ordered that the other engine be started so that we could move out of the path of the oncoming steamer. The moment the engine started to turn, however, there was a grinding sound of tortured steel, and when it had been stopped, we found that someone had placed a cold chisel in one of the gears. It was another 2 days before we were ready to limp along half repaired. The night before the repairs were completed, the sentry came to my room and awoke me. He was rather an intelligent fellow of the English middle class, in whom I had much confidence. "Well, Wilson," I asked, "what's the matter now?" He raised his finger to his lips and came closer to me. "I think I've found out who's doin' the mischief," he whispered, and nodded his head toward the girl's room. "I seen her sneakin' from the crew's room just now," he went on. "She'd been in gassin' with the bush commander. Benson seen her in there last night, too, but he never said nothin' till I goes on watch tonight. Benson's sorter slow in the head, and he never puts 2 and 2 together till someone else has made 4 of it." If the man had come in and struck me suddenly in the face, I could have been no more surprised. "Say nothing of this to anyone," I ordered. "Keep your eyes and ears open, and report every suspicious thing you see or hear." The man saluted and left me, but for an hour or more I tossed restless upon my hard bunk in an agony of jealousy and fear. Finally I fell into a troubled sleep. It was daylight when I awoke. We were steaming along slowly upon the surface, my orders having been to proceed at half speed until we could take an observation and determine our position. The sky had been overcast all the previous day and all night, but as I stepped into the centrale that morning, I was delighted to see that the sun was again shining. The spirits of the men seemed improved. Everything seemed propitious. I forgot at once the cruel misgivings of the past night as I set to work to take my observations. What a blow awaited me! The sextant and chronometer had both been broken beyond repair, and they had been broken just this very night. They had been broken upon the night that Lys had been seen talking with von Schoenvorts. I think that it was this last thought which hurt me the worst. I could look the other disaster in the face with equanimity, but the bald fact that Lys might be a traitor appalled me. I called Bradley and Olson on deck and told them what had happened, but for the life of me I couldn't bring myself to repeat what Wilson had reported to me the previous night. In fact, as I had given the matter thought, it seemed incredible that the girl could have passed through my room, in which Bradley and I slept, and then carried on a conversation in the crew's room, in which von Schoenvorts was kept without having been seen by more than a single man. Bradley shook his head. "I can't make it out," he said. "One of those Boches must be pretty clever to come it over us all like this. But they haven't harmed us as much as they think. There are still the extra instruments." It was my turn now to shake a doleful head. "There are no extra instruments," I told them. "They too have disappeared, as did the wireless apparatus." Both men looked at me in amazement. "We still have the compass and the sun," said Olson. "They may be after getting the compass some night, but there's too many of us around in the daytime for 'em to get the sun." It was then that one of the men stuck his head up through the hatchway, and seeing me, asked permission to come on deck and get a breath of fresh air. I recognized him as Benson, the man who Wilson had said reported having seen Lys with von Schoenvorts 2 nights before. I motioned him on deck and then called him to one side, asking if he had seen anything out of the way or unusual during his trick on watch the night before. The fellow scratched his head a moment and said no, and then, as though it was an afterthought, he told me that he had seen a girl in the crew's room about midnight talking with the German commander, but as there hadn't seemed to him to be any harm in that, he hadn't said anything about it. Telling him never to fail to report to me anything in the slightest out of the ordinary routine of the ship, I dismissed him. Several of the other men now asked permission to come on deck, and soon all but those actually engaged in some necessary duty were standing around smoking and talking, all in the best of spirits. I took advantage of the absence of the men upon the deck to go below for my breakfast, which the cook was already preparing upon the electric stove. Lys, followed by Nobs, appeared as I entered the centrale. She met me with a pleasant "Good morning," which I am afraid I replied to in a tone that was rather constrained and surly. "Would you breakfast with me?" I suddenly asked the girl, determined to commence a probe of my own along the lines which duty demanded. She nodded a sweet acceptance of my invitation, and together we sat down at the little table of the officers' mess. "You slept well last night?" I asked. "All night," she replied. "I am a splendid sleeper." Her manner was so straightforward and honest that I could not bring myself to believe in her duplicity. Yet, thinking to surprise her into a betrayal of her guilt, I blurted out, "The chronometer and sextant were both destroyed last night. There is a traitor among us." But she never turned a hair by way of evidencing guilty knowledge of the catastrophe. "Who could it have been?" she cried. "The Germans would be crazy to do it, for their lives are as much at stake as ours." "Men are often glad to die for an ideal of patriotism, perhaps," I replied. "And a willingness to martyr themselves includes a willingness to sacrifice others, even those who love them. Women are much the same, except that they will go even further than most men. They will sacrifice everything, even honor, for love." I watched her face carefully as I spoke, and I thought that I detected a very faint flush mounting her cheek. Seeing an opening and an advantage, I sought to follow it up. "Take von Schoenvorts, for instance," I continued. "He would doubtless be glad to die and take us all with him, could he prevent in no other way the falling of his vessel into enemy hands. He would sacrifice anyone, even you, and if you still love him, you might be his ready tool. Do you understand me?" She looked at me in wide-eyed consternation for a moment, and then she went very white and rose from her seat. "I do," she replied, and turning her back upon me, she walked quickly toward her room. I started to follow, for even believing what I did, I was sorry that I had hurt her. I reached the door to the crew's room just behind her, and in time to see von Schoenvorts lean forward and whisper something to her as she passed. But she must have guessed that she might be watched, for she passed on. That afternoon it clouded over. The wind mounted to a gale, and the sea rose until the craft was wallowing and rolling frightfully. Nearly everyone aboard was sick. The air became foul and oppressive. For 24 hours I did not leave my post in the conning tower, as both Olson and Bradley were sick. Finally I found that I must get a little rest, and so I looked about for someone to relieve me. Benson volunteered. He had not been sick, and assured me that he was a former RN man and had been detailed for submarine duty for over 2 years. I was glad that it was he, for I had considerable confidence in his loyalty, and so it was with a feeling of security that I went below and lay down. I slept 12 hours straight, and when I awoke and discovered what I had done, I lost no time in getting to the conning tower. There sat Benson as wide awake as could be, and the compass showed that we were heading straight into the west. The storm was still raging, nor did it abate its fury until the 4th day. We were all pretty well done up, and looked forward to the time when we could go on deck and fill our lungs with fresh air. During the whole 4 days I had not seen the girl, as she evidently kept closely to her room, and during this time no untoward incident had occurred aboard the boat, a fact which seemed to strengthen the web of circumstantial evidence about her. For 6 more days after the storm lessened, we still had fairly rough weather, nor did the sun once show himself during all that time. For the season, it was now the middle of June, the storm was unusual, but being from Southern California, I was accustomed to unusual weather. In fact, I have discovered that the world over, unusual weather prevails at all times of the year. We kept steadily to our westward course, and as the U-33 was one of the fastest submersibles we had ever turned out, I knew that we must be pretty close to the North American coast. What puzzled me most was the fact that for 6 days we had not sighted a single ship. It seemed remarkable that we could cross the Atlantic almost to the coast of the American continent without glimpsing smoke or sail, and at last I came to the conclusion that we were way off our course, but whether to the north or to the south of it I could not determine. On the 7th day the sea lay comparatively calm at early dawn. There was a slight haze upon the ocean which had cut off our view of the stars, but conditions all pointed toward a clear morrow, and I was on deck anxiously awaiting the rising of the sun. My eyes were glued upon the impenetrable mist astern, for there in the east I should see the first glow of the rising sun that would assure me we were still upon the right course. Gradually the heavens lightened, but astern I could see no intenser glow that would indicate the rising sun behind the mist. Bradley was standing at my side. Presently he touched my arm. "Look, captain," he said, and pointed south. I looked and gasped, for there, directly to port, I saw outlined through the haze the red top of the rising sun. Hurrying to the tower, I looked at the compass. It showed that we were holding steadily upon our westward course. Either the sun was rising in the south, or the compass had been tampered with. The conclusion was obvious. I went back to Bradley and told him what I had discovered. "And," I concluded, "we can't make another 500 knots without oil. Our provisions are running low, and so is our water. God only knows how far south we have run." "There is nothing to do," he replied, "other than to alter our course once more toward the west. We must raise land soon, or we shall all be lost." I told him to do so, and then I set to work improvising a crude sextant with which we finally took our bearings in a rough and most unsatisfactory manner, for when the work was done we did not know how far from the truth the result might be. It showed us to be about 20 minutes north and 30 minutes west, nearly 2,500 miles off our course. In short, if our reading was anywhere near correct, we must have been traveling due south for 6 days. Bradley now relieved Benson, for we had arranged our shifts so that the latter and Olson now divided the nights, while Bradley and I alternated with one another during the days. I questioned both Olson and Benson closely in the matter of the compass, but each stoutly maintained that no one had tampered with it during his tour of duty. Benson gave me a knowing smile, as much as to say, "Well, you and I know who did this." Yet I could not believe that it was the girl. We kept to our westerly course for several hours, when the lookout's cry announced a sail. I ordered the U-33's course altered, and we bore down upon the stranger, for I had come to a decision which was the result of necessity. We could not lie there in the middle of the Atlantic and starve to death if there was any way out of it. The sailing ship saw us while we were still a long way off, as was evidenced by her efforts to escape. There was scarcely any wind, however, and her case was hopeless. So when we drew near and signaled her to stop, she came into the wind and lay there with her sails flapping idly. We moved in quite close to her. She was the Balman of Halmstad, Sweden, with a general cargo from Brazil for Spain. I explained our circumstances to her skipper and asked for food, water, and oil. But when he found that we were not German, he became very angry and abusive, and started to draw away from us. But I was in no mood for any such business. Turning toward Bradley, who was in the conning tower, I snapped out, "Gun service on deck, to the diving stations." We had no opportunity for drill, but every man had been posted as to his duties, and the German members of the crew understood that it was obedience or death for them, as each was accompanied by a man with a pistol. Most of them, though, were only too glad to obey me. Bradley passed the order down into the ship, and a moment later the gun crew clambered up the narrow ladder and at my direction trained their piece upon the slow-moving Swede. "Fire a shot across her bow," I instructed the gun captain. Accept it from me, it didn't take that Swede long to see the error of his way and get the red and white pennant signifying "I understand" to the masthead. Once again the sails flapped idly, and then I ordered him to lower a boat and come after me. With Olson and a couple of Englishmen I boarded the ship, and from her cargo selected what we needed: oil, provisions, and water. I gave the master of the Balmen a receipt for what we took, together with an affidavit signed by Bradley, Olson, and myself, stating briefly how we had come into possession of the U-33 and the urgency of our need for what we took. We addressed both to any British agent with the request that the owners of the Balmen be reimbursed, but whether or not they were, I do not know. Note: late in July 1916, an item in the shipping news mentioned a Swedish sailing vessel, Balmen, Rey de Janeiro, to Barcelona, sunk by a German raider sometime in June. A single survivor in an open boat was picked up off the Cape Verde Islands in a dying condition. He expired without giving any details. With water, food, and oil aboard, we felt that we had obtained a new lease of life. Now, too, we knew definitely where we were, and I determined to make for Georgetown, British Guiana, but I was destined to again suffer bitter disappointment. 6 of us of the loyal crew had come on deck either to serve the gun or board the Swede during our set-to with her, and now one by one we descended the ladder into the centrale. I was the last to come, and when I reached the bottom I found myself looking into the muzzle of a pistol in the hands of Baron Friedrich von Schoenvorts. I saw all my men lined up at one side, with the remaining 8 Germans standing guard over them. I couldn't imagine how it had happened, but it had. Later I learned that they had first overpowered Benson, who was asleep in his bunk, and taken his pistol from him, and then had found it an easy matter to disarm the cook and the remaining 2 Englishmen below. After that it had been comparatively simple to stand at the foot of the ladder and arrest each individual as he descended. The first thing von Schoenvorts did was to send for me and announce that as a pirate I was to be shot early the next morning. Then he explained that the U-33 would cruise in these waters for a time, sinking neutral and enemy shipping indiscriminately, and looking for one of the German raiders that was supposed to be in these parts. He didn't shoot me the next morning as he had promised, and it has never been clear to me why he postponed the execution of my sentence. Instead, he kept me ironed just as he had been. Then he kicked Bradley out of my room and took it all to himself. We cruised for a long time, sinking many vessels, all but one by gunfire, but we did not come across a German raider. I was surprised to note that von Schoenvorts often permitted Benson to take command, but I reconciled this by the fact that Benson appeared to know more of the duties of a submarine commander than did any of the stupid Germans. Once or twice Lys passed me, but for the most part she kept to her room. The first time she hesitated as though she wished to speak to me, but I did not raise my head, and finally she passed on. Then one day came the word that we were about to round the Horn, and that von Schoenvorts had taken it into his fool head to cruise up along the Pacific coast of North America and prey upon all sorts and conditions of merchantmen. "I'll put the fear of God and the Kaiser into them," he said. The very first day we entered the South Pacific we had an adventure. It turned out to be quite the most exciting adventure I had ever encountered. It fell about this way. About 8 bells of the forenoon watch I heard a hail from the deck, and presently the footsteps of the entire ship's company, from the amount of noise I heard at the ladder. Someone yelled back to those who had not yet reached the level of the deck, "It's the raider, the German raider, Geyer." I saw that we had reached the end of our rope. Below all was quiet. Not a man remained. A door opened at the end of the narrow hull, and presently Nobs came trotting up to me. He licked my face and rolled over on his back, reaching for me with his big awkward paws. Then other footsteps sounded, approaching me. I knew whose they were, and I looked straight down at the flooring. The girl was coming almost at a run. She was at my side immediately. "Here!" she cried. "Quick!" And she slipped something into my hand. It was a key, the key to my irons. At my side she also laid a pistol, and then she went on into the centrale. As she passed me, I saw that she carried another pistol for herself. It did not take me long to liberate myself, and then I was at her side. "How can I thank you?" I started, but she shut me up with a word. "Do not thank me," she said coldly. "I do not care to hear your thanks or any other expression from you. Do not stand there looking at me. I have given you a chance to do something. Now do it." The last was a peremptory command that made me jump. Glancing up, I saw that the tower was empty, and I lost no time in clambering up, looking about me. About 100 yards off lay a small, swift cruiser raider, and above her floated the German man-of-war's flag. A boat had just been lowered, and I could see it moving toward us, filled with officers and men. The cruiser lay dead ahead. My, I thought, what a wonderful tart! I stopped even thinking, so surprised and shocked was I by the boldness of my imagery. The girl was just below me. I looked down on her wistfully. Could I trust her? Why had she released me at this moment? I must! There was no other way. I dropped back below. "Ask Olson to step down here, please," I requested, "and don't let anyone see you ask him." She looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face for the barest fraction of a second, and then she turned and went up the ladder. A moment later Olson returned, and the girl followed him. "Quick!" I whispered to the big Irishman, and made for the bow compartment where the torpedo tubes are built into the boat. Here, too, were the torpedoes. The girl accompanied us, and when she saw the thing I had in mind, she stepped forward and lent a hand to the swinging of the great cylinder of death and destruction into the mouth of its tube. With oil and main strength we shoved the torpedo home and shut the tube. Then I ran back to the conning tower, praying in my heart of hearts that the U-33 had not swung her bow away from the prey. No, thank God. Never could aim have been truer. I signaled back to Olson. "Let her go!" The U-33 trembled from stem to stern as the torpedo shot from its tube. I saw the white wake leap from her bow straight toward the enemy cruiser. A chorus of hoarse yells arose from the deck of our own craft. I saw the officers stand suddenly erect in the boat that was approaching us, and I heard loud cries and curses from the raider. Then I turned my attention to my own business. Most of the men on the submarine's deck were standing in paralyzed fascination, staring at the torpedo. Bradley happened to be looking toward the conning tower and saw me. I sprang on deck and ran toward him. "Quick!" I whispered. "While they are stunned, we must overcome them." A German was standing near Bradley, just in front of him. The Englishman struck the fellow a frantic blow upon the neck, and at the same time snatched his pistol from its holster. Von Schoenvorts had recovered from his first surprise quickly, and had turned toward the main hatch to investigate. I covered him with my revolver, and at the same instant the torpedo struck the raider, the terrific explosion drowning the German's command to his men. Bradley was now running from one to another of our men, and though some of the Germans saw and heard him, they seemed too stunned for action. Olson was below, so that there were only 9 of us against 8 Germans, for the man Bradley had struck still lay upon the deck. Only 2 of us were armed, but the heart seemed to have gone out of the Boches, and they put up but half-hearted resistance. Von Schoenvorts was the worst. He was fairly frenzied with rage and chagrin, and he came charging for me like a mad bull, and as he came he discharged his pistol. If he'd stopped long enough to take aim, he might have gotten me, but his pace made him wild, so that not a shot touched me, and then we clinched and went to the deck. This left 2 pistols, which 2 of my men were quick to appropriate. The Baron was no match for me in a hand-to-hand encounter, and I soon had him pinned to the deck and the life almost choked out of him. A half hour later things had quieted down, and all was much the same as before the prisoners had revolted, only we kept a much closer watch on von Schoenvorts. The Geyer had sunk while we were still battling upon our deck, and afterward we had drawn away toward the north, leaving the survivors to the attention of the single boat which had been making its way toward us when Olson launched the torpedo. I suppose the poor devils never reached land, and if they did, they most probably perished on that cold and unhospitable shore, but I couldn't permit them aboard the U-33. We had all the Germans we could take care of. That evening the girl asked permission to go on deck. She said that she felt the effects of long confinement below, and I readily granted her request. I could not understand her, and I craved an opportunity to talk with her again in an effort to fathom her and her intentions, and so I made it a point to follow her up the ladder. It was a clear, cold, beautiful night. The sea was calm except for the white water at our bow, and the two long radiating swells running far off into the distance upon either hand astern, forming a great V which our propellers filled with choppy waves. Benson was in the tower. We were bound for San Diego, and all looked well. Lys stood with a heavy blanket wrapped around her slender figure, and as I approached her, she half turned toward me to see who it was. When she recognized me, she immediately turned away. "I want to thank you," I said, "for your bravery and loyalty. You were magnificent. I am sorry that you had reason before to think that I doubted you." "You did doubt me," she replied in a level voice. "You practically accused me of aiding Baron von Schoenvorts. I can never forgive you." There was a great deal of finality in both her words and tone. "I could not believe it," I said, "and yet two of my men reported having seen you in conversation with von Schoenvorts late at night upon two separate occasions, after each of which some great damage was found done us in the morning. I didn't want to doubt you, but I carried all the responsibility of the lives of these men, of the safety of the ship, of your life and mine. I had to watch you, and I had to put you on your guard against a repetition of your madness." She was looking at me now with those great eyes of hers, very wide and round. "Who told you that I spoke with Baron von Schoenvorts at night, or any other time?" she asked. "I cannot tell you, Lys," I replied, "but it came to me from two different sources." "Then two men have lied," she asserted without heat. "I have not spoken to Baron von Schoenvorts other than in your presence when first we came aboard the U-33. And please, when you address me, remember that to others than my intimates I am Miss La Rue." "Did you ever get slapped in the face when you least expected it? No? Well, then you do not know how I felt at that moment. I could feel the hot, red flush surging up my neck, across my cheeks, over my ears, clear to my scalp, and it made me love her all the more. It made me swear inwardly 1,000 solemn oaths that I would win her." End of chapter 3.